Well, good afternoon. I'm Roger Baker, Senior Vice President for Stratfor at RAIN.
I'm Scott Curtis. I'm an Asia Pacific analyst with RAIN, and we're here to talk about the DPRK missile launches.
Right, and obviously, Scott, given that all attention right now is focused on the Ukrainian frontier, what better time to talk about North Korea? But I think, it's important to remember that while everyone is focused on one crisis, we can't forget that the rest of the world keeps moving. Things are still happening. The future still matters all over the world. And after the January round of tests, it seems like a really important time to start talking about and rethinking about North Korea, particularly as the world comes out of 2 years of COVID isolation.
Definitely. Yeah, the recent missile tests were kind of, everyone talked to me and they said, well, it's January, it's not their missile testing time. And it's like, well, they've had 2 years of COVID where they really didn't test that much, and they're kind of just making up for lost time.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. Usually, we see spring tests, we see autumn tests. They steer clear of bad weather or places where they may have increased failure. Certainly, the last 2 years, we've seen about half as many missile tests as there were in the couple of years before the U.S. North Korean summitry.
Mm-hmm.
So some sense of coming back on pace, but mostly, and I know we worked together on a piece on this. Mostly, what I've been seeing is the focus in the last 3 years plus on short range systems, on battlefield systems for operations within the Korean Peninsula, as opposed to what we were seeing in 2017 and such, where it was long range nuclear capable missiles, all of the fears of alarms in Guam and in Hawaii and maybe Los Angeles.
Yeah, I remember seeing like one of the press releases from North Korea. They're looking at a map of the U.S. and there's like Salt Lake City or something was on there. I was like, okay, like they're just trying to show that they can threaten the continental United States with the long range capabilities. But I haven't seen much out of that in the past few years. I've seen mostly, like you said, just short range, medium range ballistic missile testing, regional missile capabilities.
Right. One of the interesting things I think that we're seeing in this is if you look at the systems that they're testing, they are operational systems for use in Korea. But an interesting aspect is that they may allow the North Koreans to engage in a calibrated escalation rather than 0 to 100. And I know you've lived in Korea. I've lived in Korea. From the outside, everyone identifies it as, it's always under threat of North Korean artillery or now North Korean nuclear weapons, and you have your air raid drills and the outsider senses it as eternal crisis. The insider senses it as day after day, but largely because North Korea only had sort of two far ends of the spectrum options. They had small-scale localized provocation, sometimes pretty extreme.
With Yongpyeongdo and Cheonan,
right? They're pretty extreme, but then not much beyond that. They couldn't tactically escalate. The next step is either unleash all the artillery on the Greater Seoul area, or nuke LA. And while that may have kept the United States and the South Koreans at bay, it also seems to significantly limit North Korea's ability to use its national defense as a tool of politics and regional relations.
Yeah, because no one really wants to test a nuclear power. Like, no one really wants to actually invade North Korea because there is the risk that, and I honestly say the very likelihood that North Korea would use nuclear weapons in self-defense from a country like the United States coming in to attack Pyongyang. I would put that at pretty much a guarantee. I don't think they ever actually pose an offensive threat, which is what a lot of people are worried about. I don't foresee North Korea going off the rails and launching nuclear weapons at LA. And like you said, the ability to give themselves more options between, we'll shell the islands near Incheon, or we'll nuke Seoul and burn it to the ground. That is kind of a big deal to have that ability to escalate, which also gives South Korea now a more measured response. Because if now South Korea can respond with their own measured responses to any North Korean aggression. They don't have to worry about an immediate nuclear response, or was it the Sea of Fire? Was some of the rhetoric they talked about? So
Right. And that creates an interesting paradox as we think about the Korean Peninsula, because on the one hand, by adding in additional layers of capability, the North Koreans are not necessarily compelled in a crisis to move to the highest end of their arsenal, to move to the devastating barrage on Seoul or the launch of nuclear weapons. So reduces potentially the risk of conflict getting out of hand quickly and jumping right away up the escalation ladder to the top rung. On the other hand, it potentially increases the space for military action across the DMZ, as each side can make calculated steps to decide what they're willing to risk and what they're trying to persuade the other side to do or not do. And so you can have the North Koreans sinking a South Korean ship, and the South Koreans, instead of being very cautious about response, or even the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do, there's only a minimal response to the North Koreans militarily. But imagine if the South Koreans then say, well, we're going to take out a facility that produces MLRS systems.
yeah,
And then, because we know that that doesn't necessarily force the North Koreans to go to 100%. And then the North Koreans strike a key airfield. And now you get into this step-by-step escalation that brings the question of risk tolerance up, and has everybody looking and saying, can we what do we negotiate back down to?
yeah. And I think we mentioned in the piece too, this gives North Korea more confidence in their self-defense, which opens the door to arms control. Because I think we both know, and I think the concept of North Korea denuclearizing is fantasy, in my opinion. I don't foresee North Korea just giving up its nuclear program anytime soon. The Kim family, and everyone involved in the North Korean regime has no reason to give up their one trump card, because then they open themselves up to, again, being ousted from power, invasion, and they'll be in the International Criminal Court of Justice, and they don't want that. So I think this definitely does give them options.
Right, and it's interesting. There's increased discussion inside the United States on this concept of arms control rather than CVID or instant. You have to get rid of all nuclear program before you can even engage in dialogue or have lifting of sanctions. An arms control dynamic with North Korea is one that could see, step-by-step adjustments in sanctions, tension reduction methods, but also perhaps inspections and things of that sort. And if the North only has its nuclear arsenal, it's much less likely to be willing to accept those types of inspections, because from that perspective, those inspections lead to the targeting for removing the arsenal, right?
Yeah.
But if they have a viable conventional capability, not merely a poison shrimp strategy, but a real capability, then maybe they are more open to some form of dialogue down the road. Because in the end, it's not that North Korea wants to bomb South Korea, the US, it's that North Korea wants to break out of the sanctions box and find some ways to tap into global economics to strengthen their internal situation.
Yeah, and they really don't want to just, let's pretend, there's some fantasy worlds where suddenly things change. They don't want to just swap immediately from some U.S. sanctions to being required to be almost a U.S. puppet. Like, you have to do things the American way, you have to develop their way. They don't want that. They want to develop their own way and engage not necessarily with the EU with trade relations, but they want to look at trading more with Indonesia or Malaysia or even the Philippines, some more regional middle powers, even some Middle East powers. I know they've traded heavily with Egypt in the past, and that's caused issues. But I don't think they want to just immediately jump up and start opening to the world, so to speak.
Right, and if we think about them, North Korea feels itself to be overly dependent on China. It doesn't want to trade its Chinese dependency for U.S. dependency. It wants independence of operations, and that's actually kind of an interesting concept, because it's not just a North Korean concept. we see that in South Korea. And as we're looking at potential adjustments in North Korean behavior, or at least opportunities for adjustments in North Korean behavior over the next year, year and a half, 2 years, we're also coming up to a presidential election in South Korea, which I know you've been looking at. And as we think about presidential politics in South Korea, well, domestic issues usually drive the election. The impact is often on foreign policy, and it's centered around the U.S., China, Japan, and North Korea.
Yeah, with the upcoming election, everything kind of depends on who wins, right? You have Yoon Suk-yeol, the conservative candidate, and the Lee Jae-myung, I guess the liberal candidate, we might say, or the Democratic Party candidate. And then you have An Chol-soo. I'm getting tongue-tied here. They all have different strategies related to North Korea, and we can probably expect Yoon and An on the conservative side to be leaning more towards the Washington side, leaning more towards, I should say, stricter dialogue, stricter requirements, and even sanctions against North Korea, whereas the Democratic candidate Lee Jae-myung is probably going to be leaning more towards Beijing to engage North Korea, using Beijing as a tool to lean on North Korea and as a new or continued avenue for discussion and dialogue.
Right, and contextually, this fits into then the whole restructuring of the U.S. strategic policy toward the greater Indo-Pacific region, right? And this geopolitical clash between the United States and China, and countries sitting in between that, particularly critical countries like South Korea, who are caught in that space. They're finding themselves having limited room for operation of freedom of operation, and the presidential election potentially can have an impact on whether the Korean pendulum swings tighter into the let's constrain China camp, as it were, or stays and tries to be in the, hey, let's try to keep this balance of our economic relations with the Chinese, our security relations with the United States, and a focus on our future independent defense and security dynamic in the region. And that seems to be one of those things that the election, although internally in South Korea, you don't see that as a major issue. There's a little bit of talk about it, adding THAAD batteries, things like that.
Yeah.
But it has a big impact on the structure of the region and on the future structure of U.S. Security policy toward China.
Yeah. You mentioned the THAAD battery. That was so controversial. I was there in Korea when it was first put out. You saw the protests, you saw everything. And just by adding more, the THAAD battery, a lot of people don't even consider it to be anti-North Korean. They consider it to be anti-China, and Beijing has taken it as such. So, any move by that, you're going to see it's more viewed as an anti-Chinese move. And Beijing is probably going to respond very poorly to that because they view it as a threat, not to, as an offensive tool, but they see it as, why are you putting this missile defense system in place that would shoot down our missiles, not North Korean? So that,
right. And it also goes into things like intelligence sharing between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, that issue. And does South Korea, for example, take a more active role as a partner or an expanded member of the Quad? Does South Korea petition for AUKUS membership? Does a conservative South Korea push the United States to give them nuclear submarine technology?
Because they just had the submarine they just built, right? Or they approved of it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but they have their SLBMs, they have their missile launching submarines, but nuclear powered submarines are another step. Japan doesn't have them, but there's some concern in South Korea that the AUKUS deal might pave the way for the transfer of nuclear submarine technology to Japan down the road. Does South Korea get it? How does South Korea protect itself within that sphere? Because in the end, conservative or not in South Korea, there's still a long-term dynamic on the question of Japan further down the road.
Yeah, the security considerations with Japan have been a very sore point, I should say. The removing with the white paper in Japan, when I worked with the Korean government, suddenly some Japanese colleagues, it's like Friday they're there, and then Monday they're not. Um, it was it was an immediate turnaround, and the in South Korean society, Japan is the perennial question. How close do we get to Japan for economic reasons, for social reasons, tourism, and for defense and military cooperation? It is the eternal question. And I know conservatives tend to lean towards Tokyo, Washington, but that doesn't mean that a liberal candidate or Democratic candidate wouldn't also pursue that end. But a lot of it's still a lot of up in the air what ifs to see who wins the election. So we'll see what happens with that.
Right. So I think as we think forward on this year, it's a really interesting year. There's some shifts and adjustments in North Korea demonstrating added capabilities. And these are not brand new systems. They've been working on these for years, but they've really stepped up that testing cycle over the last 3 or 4 years, focused on targeting, focused on maneuverability,
reliability systems, different
so
launch capabilities.
So a more robust set of options for North Korea. We have a South Korean election, and with or without the flare up in Ukraine going full hot, we still have this steady expansion of the perception of tensions in the Pacific theater, right? The U.S.-China dynamic is not going to ease off anytime soon. That's only going to get worse. The U.S. is looking at has its new Pacific policy out. It's got the step-by-step expansion of activities within the region. And while the United States may say it doesn't want to force countries to choose, it's ultimately countries may not have a complete option to sit in the middle, and they may be pulled one way or another due to regulations and counter regulations, sanctions, defense arrangements, sharing of technology, information technology, things like that, may all limit countries' ability to continue to play the middle space. And so I think that watching South Korea this year with these two different changing dynamics, North Korea and South Korea, is going to be very important in understanding that broader regional balance and how that plays out.
Yeah. South Korea's long been called called North Korea the poison shrimp strategy. South Korea's always called themselves the shrimp stuck between two whales. And yeah, they are finding themselves in an increasingly difficult position to balance. Domestically speaking, South Korea the people are having a less and less positive view, more negative view, I should say, of business and working with China, which is going to have to be addressed by South Korean politicians coming forward in the next 18 months to 2 years, especially amid the rising Beijing-Washington tensions. Like you said, it's not going away anytime soon. I don't think Biden and Xi are suddenly going to sit down and and remove a lot of tariffs and restrictions that are in place.
Yeah, not going to happen anytime soon. Little chance of resolution on that quickly. I guess we have a couple of minutes left. Roll the dice. What's your odds on changes in Korea leading toward unification?
Oh, wow, that's the hard one. Attitudes towards reunification, in my experience, and this is a little anecdotal, have been a lot of South Koreans are caring less about reunification because the countries have been more or less de facto at peace when you think about it. Their parents, from growing up in the 1970s and 80s underneath Park Chung-hee, it was a different world. It was a different situation where you did have North Korean incursions. You did have spies walking in there. You did have
that was still going on in the 90s when I was there.
Yeah. Well, I was going a little farther back, but so you have a lot of the younger generation caring less about reunification and more hoping for peace. I know the young men really want peace, or because that means they hopefully don't have to do military service, which remains a big sore point in Korean culture. But I see more people thinking for peace rather than reunification. I've heard some South Koreans say, we love reunification, but it's expensive and we don't really want to pay for the whole thing. And I was like, yeah, kind of right. You got a point there.
Yeah, that said, I think that if we look at the broader regional tensions, right, there's a compulsion, maybe not for reunification, but for some sort of accommodation between the North and the South. Because as long as their number one defense concern is each other, they have limited room to find ways to balance between these rising U.S.-China tensions and the reassertion of Japanese military capabilities
Under the
within the region.
self-defense force that
But
is,
but I mean,
yeah,
you have things called destroyers that F-35s land on, so it's clearly a change in dynamic. And it's not that Japan is going to go try to take over Asia or anything like that,
no,
but
God, no.
certainly there's a change in Japan's view of itself and its role in the region. So Japan is going to be a key component of U.S. policy in the region, and for its own interests, going to be expanding its political, economic, and security influence. China is doing the same thing. The United
Hmm.
States is doing the same thing. And the two Koreas can't really find ways to balance or create independent policies so long as they're constantly having to look at each other as a primary threat and be the front line of conflict between these bigger powers. And so there is an underlying pressure driving at least a geopolitical pressure driving for accommodation. But as you note, there's social dynamics, there's economic dynamics, and there's just the raw difficulty of finding ways to get over much of what has happened in the past, and for the North Koreans to even feel confident about potentially giving up some of their leverage through tensions.
Yeah, I mean, you also mentioned China. I know some people in Korea say like any war in Asia between the United States and China would start in South Korea or on the DMZ. It's like because you're not China doesn't want to fight in China, and using North Korea as a political lever would definitely does definitely impact regional politics and defense concerns because, like you said, South Korea can't look too far around the region if they always have to worry about the DMZ and the 30th parallel.
Mm-hmm.
So it is an eternal question. And I've had some thoughts on, and I think we've talked too about the thoughts of, what would it take for reunification besides just the what wishes and hopes. But we got some good comments here, some good questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, the when you look at South Korea, the big question on South Korea and Japan on diesel submarines versus nuclear submarines. Certainly, diesel submarines serve in the near waters. The question is, are South Korea and Japan seeing themselves as needing that long range capability because of their extended supply lines? Right.
Yeah.
And that's obviously Australia's perception of need, that where Australia is going to be needing to engage in conflict may be very far from Australian shores. And right now we look at Korea and say, oh, any Korean issues are right next door to Korea. Even Japan, they're going to be in and around the waters around Japan. But I think we also need to look at the way that countries look at both their ambitions and their long-term security dynamic. Um, the ambition side is you want to show that you have a capability that's strong and bigger than some of your neighbors. But the long-term security dynamic is, look, South Korea sits at the tail end of a very long supply chain for its imports, key commodity imports, and its exports to key markets. Those routes are vulnerable to interdiction by others. Right now, the United States largely ensures the movement of goods and services. But can South Korea always count on that? And so it's not that they desperately need these for their security dynamic, but these do play a role in the way they're thinking in long-term aspects of where are Korea's interests, where are Japan's interests, and they're no longer just in their neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned supply chains. That's been one of the biggest worries of South Korea for years. Is they've been worrying about disruptions to supply chains. I think the Suez Canal shows exactly what it was. Just one small thing completely backlogged everything so hard in East Asia. Well, not just Korea, but East Asia in general. And piracy down as you go through the Straits of Malacca, and I probably pronounced that very poorly. I apologize. That's been a concern for a lot of South Korean importers because they're worried about their oil, gas, and coal supplies. They're worried about raw material supplies coming through that straits, and how do they project their power to defend their supply lines? And can they rely, or should they rely on the United States to continue to be the oceanic police force. I don't know if that's a proper way to term that, but
Look, it's the dominant maritime power in the world. The United States, has replaced the UK as the dominant global maritime power, and it ensures the freedom of the commons. But as we see the expansion of Chinese maritime capability, trying to ensure their own freedom of the commons and push the US back, you get these increases in regional and localized tensions that can create disruptions. And so countries, I think, don't always want to rely on one or two big powers to take care of everything. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And we see that very clearly in the change in the Japanese defense policy over years, right? They've done things for a very long time. It's not new that Japan is changing things. I mean, I remember in the 90s discussions in Japan coming out in the public on the potential for future nuclear weapons or aircraft carriers or things. They won't change their constitution, but most everything that they've done recently is clearly in violation of the way in which they define their constitution, or that they used to define it. So these do impact the way local countries look, smaller countries look and act. And yeah, as someone noted, big powers can seem to do whatever they want because they have the money and they have the cash and they can do things. And even small, wealthy countries can sometimes focus on things. You look at some of the air forces in the Middle East and wonder about those. They're not always for a real purpose. Sometimes they're just as a demonstration of capability and wealth. But I think that as South Korea looks at, there's a real debate in the South Korean defense between I think the conservatives who still look at keeping the United States as a primary component of national defense, and the liberal progressives who are looking at what about a future independent national defense, national security posture, and what would we need for that? And that's where you see things like the Tokto or
Tokto
future
Takashima.
LPX. No, the Tokto, the LPX. Tokto,
okay.
Or future, future amphibious capabilities, future submarine capabilities, potential for longer range assets than what they've normally had.
Yeah. Yeah, especially, I mean, you mentioned kind of the debate of nuclear capabilities. I know in South Korea, for example, nuclear powered anything has a very, very negative connotation with a lot of people. Like I've seen demonstrations against nuclear power plants, partly for security reasons. They said it's easy to blow up and then, irradiate the countryside, but partly because a lot of people don't want anything that can be nuclear capable on the Korean Peninsula because they believe that is an antagonistic action towards North Korea and or China. And not to mention the non-proliferation treaty extends to the whole peninsula. But South Korea's, some people have been petitioning South Korea to be allowed to develop its own nuclear weapons. I know they recently lifted the ballistic missile testing restrictions on South Korea. So that's also something to think about too. I kind of see that a lot of South Korean politicians have a foreign policy and they think this and they're worried about security concerns, but they definitely cannot ignore the very politically active population. So while some politicians might want to develop some things, they probably can't out of worrying about losing their job.
Yeah. Strategic logic and political imperatives do not always align.
No, they do not.
And that becomes even stronger in democratic states. And it's just the cost of being a democratic state. It's not a weakness or a strength. Yeah. It's just the cost of it.
It's just a fact of having a robust democracy. So, okay.
Well, I think there's plenty more to talk on this, but I think we've hit about the end here for today.
For today. Well, it's good talking to you, Roger.
Yeah, good talking to you. If folks are interested, you can go to worldview.stratfor.com and
we have a banner somewhere.
There should be a banner coming up, and you can see a couple of pieces that that Scott worked on and I worked on recently on looking at this North Korean missile dynamic, and then looking at some of the potential implications of the upcoming South Korean election. And we'll certainly keep following these issues and updating as we go forward.
Definitely. Hope everyone watching has a good day.
All right. Bye-bye.